Hi, all. Welcome back to Cinematicians. My name is Joe Alvarez, and welcome back to the channel. Anyway, so today I have on another guest, a good friend of mine from Wyoming Catholic College, who is also mutually interested in film. He also wrote his thesis on film as a part of our artistic tradition, and I'm happy to introduce to you guys John Paul Mantyh. JP, welcome in.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show, Joe.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Some of the topics I have in front of me were just from our last phone call, and I just thought they were pretty interesting topics, and I'd just like to enter those topics with you for this episode. So I think when I last called you, you were kind of in a horror movie phase, and I'd love to hear your comments on that. Like, care to name some of your favorites or any certain qualities that you liked about those?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, some of the classics are definitely coming to mind. Like Psycho is obviously a really great film. Like kind of Hitchcock's only one of his few attempts at a real horror film. Um, I was sort of thinking about the other day if I were to adapt a horror franchise myself, I think Nightmare on Elm Street would be something really interesting. I think something about the idea of a supernatural slasher appeals to me just aesthetically, but um. I think in general, just what I really enjoy about the genre is it's, despite being sort of a very sensationalized genre, it's very much about characters specifically confronting evil in some respect, where
Mhm.
like there's a very concrete manifestation of evil that the characters have to confront.
Yeah, I was so a couple things come to mind because they also came up in the last conversation. The first thing is I just finished today the the case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So it's a prominent example of what you're saying, where uh it's dealing with the interior evil, right? And it's
Right.
facing that evil and the disturbance it has on relationships and friendships when the evil does come out and we don't face it head on. Um, at least that's a kind of metaphysical way of looking at that story without just appreciating it as a story. Um,
Which
and
version of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde was this?
Oh, this was the actual novella
Ah,
by
okay.
Chris Stevenson. Yeah, I just finished reading that. There is, of course, like a 1941 version that I started watching, um, and it was really funny because it's not, you know, excuse me, it's not, quite true to the original novella. I think it was probably done on a low budget. It was done by Americans. You can tell when they're like faking accents and when some of them have clear American accents. Like I think Jekyll is a guy who has a prominent American accent for the time. It worked as far as that goes, but I never ended up finishing it. I think I fell asleep halfway through. But
Um,
it was that time of the night. But that I was inspired to read that, and hopefully soon I'll get into Dracula because one, you brought up horror, and then two, I found a really interesting podcast about these two guys. It's called "Are You Afraid of the Dark Universe?" And these two guys, they claim were approached by Universal to revamp a franchise of horror or monster genre films in an MCU franchise format where you have all the characters of monsters and their friends or enemies kind of coming in together in this one universe, the dark universe, as it were.
yeah.
Because Universal started with The Mummy with Tom Cruise in 2017, which is a financial and critical flop. Uh, anyway, that's where the podcast came from. I went a few episodes into it. Of course, being a conservative Catholic, I didn't like how much they were just randomly throwing in leftist agendas deliberately. So I stopped listening to it after about 5 episodes. But Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde apparently plays a big part because one of the primary characters in The Mummy is Dr. Henry Jekyll. So now I'm gonna and then you brought up horror when I called you, and so I'm kind of inspired to re-enter into that genre because I personally haven't really watched a ton of horror movies. I think I've seen The Shining, A Quiet Place. I never ended up finishing The Human Centipede because it's such a whacked up film. Oh, I did
Yeah.
see I did see Psycho, and I had and it's an interesting it's an interesting film in my opinion. I think they summed it up really quickly at the last 2 minutes, but
Sure.
it was well such a classic, right? It's well done throughout the rest of the film. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, Psycho is very much kind of the original slasher film in
Right,
many ways.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. I had some other things on the docket. I'm trying to what I'll do right now is I'll go ahead and enter into your thesis, which
Sure.
was
Yeah.
pretty interesting stuff, by the way. I enjoyed reading it. As quickly as I read it since you sent it to me like an hour and a half ago, and then perused as much as I can through it. But it was hard to try and uh, miss a ton of it because it was very it looked at the basics of film and how it features into the artistic tradition. Would you care to say kind of a maybe a summary or just say something about that to that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think in a way it was a really positive experience writing that because it kind of helped me to explore sort of like what film is essentially. And like, I think what especially interested me was kind of that idea of when you contrast film to something like theater, what you immediately realize is that, Aristotle talks about that idea of in theater there is diction and spectacle, where diction being the words of the play and spectacle being the performance itself. Where in a film, spectacle takes center, becomes primary. While in a play, it's the diction that's primary. I think like we can read a play and say we know the play, but you can't read a film script and say you know the film. We're kind of solidifying that idea that film very much is a visual medium where it's about how is the image framed, how do you pair images together, and yeah, I mean some in it's not obviously not to suggest that the script isn't important in a film. I think we know it very much is, but the way the script is presented is very much about the visual rather than almost what is being said. I think that really was what really interested me as I was digging into that.
Yeah, no, the that was one thing we were a couple of years ago when I was doing I think my second play outdoor trip for Wyoming Catholic College because
Yeah.
we're a weird school that can do that. Um, and we had Suzanka with us on
Mm-hmm.
that uh, and he we were talking about what the we were talking about that very subject where you can read a film or read a play, excuse me. Um, we didn't actually touch on film, but you can read a play, but it's a different experience from watching the play performed because while the script while it's much more heavy on the dialogue, the performance plays such an important aspect to its very nature. So
Sure.
that has always stuck with me in the concept of theater, and then a step further with film. And you talked about that with in your thesis where you go into the framing of a shot, the editing of each shot put together. Um, and I had chills every time whenever you were bringing in the Prince of Egypt scene from that document from that. So that was really fun. And then also the cinematography, how the camera moves and how it's used as kind of the eyeball of the audience. And finally, the acting too. The acting is a substantial difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Uh, so I
Well,
found
no,
that excellent. Yeah.
yeah, well, no, it is so interesting how like obviously the performance of an actor still is very important in theater, but it is so interesting. Like the example obviously I give from The Godfather of how Al Pacino was able to convey so much without saying a word in that scene, like in a way you just simply couldn't on stage. It would just feel awkward.
Hmm.
It's
I
all like the camera's in his face, and he has to show so much to his through his face.
yeah, and so one thing that I found really interesting, I'm gonna have to read the original memoir, but the show The Offer was kind of a dramatized version of the making of The Godfather. And of course, the upper producer of the whole company, when it was still Gulf and Western Paramount, um, he was threatening to kind of shut the whole project down. And then he was convinced to come on the set, and that very scene was what convinced him to let the project keep going.
Don't worry, Charlie, it's not real.
Yeah, he was so struck by that.
Yeah, no, that is just such an incredible story. And Francis Ford Coppola rescheduled to shoot that scene because he knew
Yeah.
Al Pacino was going to impress them.
Well, then on top of that too, that you had the mafia actually supporting it once the producer, was able to talk to I think it was crud, I'm forgetting the name of the mob boss at the time. I'll probably edit it in later when I'm
Think
doing
it
the
was the Colombo crime family. I forget
Columbo.
who.
It was Columbo,
Yeah,
Joe Columbo. Yeah. But yeah, the Offer is such a fascinating series. You have you seen that?
I have not gotten around to that yet. No,
Yeah.
but I do know a lot about the workings from behind the
Yeah.
Godfather.
Yeah, it's spectacular. Yeah. So one thing that kind of struck me too was being WCC, there are only like a select number of theses that talk about film. I think I was only able to uh, bring up in my own memory mine, yours. Nick Curley also had a thesis on film. And it was kind of funny because the way that we talk about these films, while are kind of circulating it in a special way that I can't quite articulate. And I almost want to call them a trilogy with Eastland Ullman's, or formerly Ullman's thesis, kind of being a little side quest. Um,
Hmm.
and so you have the original, like I think it was 2013 when Curly graduated, where he talked about film as a fine art. And then I guess I would say that mine was the belated sequel, which distinguished the art of film, the distinguished morality within the art of film. Then yours kind of circles back in the direction of Curly's, where you introduce film as the modern medium in the tradition of art. Um, it's very similar to Curly's, but also kind of a different method of talking about it, which I found interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and I think within WCC, obviously, there's the sense that, like, we're talking about these great books and talking about great literature and music, and there's a reason why with a classic education you'd be hesitant to kind of bring film into the conversation because it is such a new medium. In a way, it's not quite as proven as some of the older mediums, but I think that's what drew us to talking about it was sort of like, well, no, this kind of fits into that tradition. So that's what it, even if it unofficially, that's definitely something we as WCC students should have been talking about.
Right. And I think we're the school anyway, from what I hear is, or even experience, is also moving more in the direction of including film as an artistic medium. I think in the humanities department in senior year, you look at a couple of films in the sense of a novel, right? Lots
Yes.
of movies are done in a very novel-esque sense. It's almost the new. It's bringing together a bunch of forms of art, right? You have the visual, the musical, and the storytelling form of it. Um, I had a thought going with that direction, but I'm not quite sure what to make of it.
Well, it's very interesting, I think. Hmm, what something I've sort of thought about is like I would almost argue, especially television seems to very much, at least, sort of like more modern television shows where it is one more of a cohesive story. I think very much resembles like the classic novel. I picked up watching Breaking Bad again recently, like rewatching that show, and that is so much resembles a 19th century novel, just in the format of it, where it really is like each episode is a chapter, each season is a book of the novel, where it is this long kind of epic story told through 63 hours of television.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's true. I also just finished Band of Brothers, which is just a phenomenal show. I highly recommend anyone watching this go watch that. If they so does well, I can't recommend it universally. Obviously, it
Sure, it's not
obviously
for
is a
everybody.
very military film, so there's plenty of language and violence and even sexual themes going on. Sexual moments that happen in the show, but it really does stand out as I think I looked up some articles and it is rated probably the number one TV military TV show uh, in the
Awesome.
in the of the century thus far. Or yeah, so yeah, thus far. So it's and moving and kind of segueing into a another topic we might have touched on before, but I've also talked about it with others, so I'm really not sure the connection or
Hmm.
who I've talked to about this. But military films, especially those 2010 and prior, tend to have an overall sense of virtue, like a heightened sense of virtue that we don't have just in our modern day and age. Um, I mean, you could probably say something to that as well. Like, I don't know.
Sure. Well, no, it is very interesting. I think, yeah, I mean, I think back to Saving Private Ryan in a way it was kind of the production precursor to Band of Brothers. Um, that film was very interested in morality, just from the standpoint of, kind of how war is putting man back kind of in that state of nature, where he has to make these moral decisions maybe with less structure than we do in on a daily basis. And I think of the scene when they have to decide whether or not to kill Steamboat Willie.
Mhm.
When Tom Hanks just kind of goes through this phase of realizing I I could have chosen to kill this person, which is something I never would have done before or this war. And how much have I changed because of all this? Like what has this war done to me? Like so very much interested in exploring kind of making moral choices under those circumstances and like the moral difficulties that brings out. So yeah, I think that is right. It's very interested in morality, maybe, well, in a possibly more constructive way than some more modern films.
Oh, for sure. And well, even just to
Hmm.
I was also watching I was kind of on a very brief military themed film TV phase. I
Yeah.
also just watched We Were Soldiers. Fun fact, my uncle who was in the army at the time was actually an extra in that film.
That's awesome.
I wasn't able to spot him, but it was just kind of fun to know. Um
Sure.
but it's placed in the Vietnam War, but it goes back also to the virtue of obedience, which I think
Sure.
this culture, even outside of the medium of film, has kind of lost. Um, so like I've seen even in my workplace, I've seen out in the streets of Nashville, like there's there's a sense of not quite liberality, but too much of a swing on the freedom of the individual, that
Sure.
there's less of the of a sense of a common good taking place, um, which I think we could really learn from in these epic war films. You know.
Well, yeah, and I think it's something I kind of wondered about how in many settings, including in the workplace, there's very much an atmosphere of the person who can be a stickler about the rules is often frowned upon.
Right.
Where it's like, and granted, there maybe that's a discussion of how much do we need to be a stickler about rules in the workplace, but it does seem like there's not, in general, perhaps not as much of a respect for it as one could hope. Where in something like in the military, you have to respect the rules, otherwise the whole thing ceases to function. That discipline is essential, and yeah, I think that's something that we could definitely learn from. That valuing that could probably make any workplace work much better and make us, frankly, better workers.
Yeah. Well, and it kind of another thing that I've been paying attention to, listening to, was I've been listening to Pints with Aquinas,
Ah, yes, yes.
audio, podcast with Matt Fradd, and
Hmm.
one thing. Well, he also has uh, he also has a priest kind of do little 30-minute talks as well on that show. I'm blanking on his name right now, but he what's that?
I'm not sure if I remember now. It's been a while since I
Yeah, I'm
checked
gonna
in.
have to look it up in a second, but he talked about our overemphasis on the idea of justice, and it's always justice towards oneself, not one's participation in justice around them, um, and so there's uh, I think I think part of that too is the lack of sacrifice of oneself to, the common project or the mission or whatever it might be, uh,
Mhm.
that's indicated through that sense. What am I saying? That the sense of obedience kind of points to in these military films.
Well, right, and I think, yeah, I think that's true. Where it's also that in a military setting, like in those type of military films, there's very clearly is a common project. Where I think in just kind of everyday civilian life, it's very easy for us to not see ourselves as part of some common good, where it's very much kind of, well, we're a bunch of individual goods that individual people with individual goals that kind of overlap at times.
Yeah, yeah. Father Gregory Pine, I just found it
Oh,
out.
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
And then, of course, Mother Natalia also does some spirituality episodes as well. So those are always fascinating. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, I guess taking on the theme of virtue in film. This was a while back when I saw this review, but so Bishop Barron, Robert Barron, who was formerly the bishop of, I think, Santa Barbara in Los Angeles. Now he's in Wisconsin, I believe.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I guess I would.
somewhere, Wisconsin or Michigan. I honestly don't remember. They sent him to a kind of small diocese.
Okay.
Um, but he has this review on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. You got to see that film, right?
I did, and I did see Father Baron's review as well.
Yeah, yeah. And he kind of indicates how Brad Pitt's character Booth is kind of the embodiment of all four of the Aristotelian virtues. Um, and I find that pretty fascinating. Of course, a lot of people kind of object to that film, morally speaking. So
Mhm.
it's always fun to see that dichotomy play out.
Well, right. I mean, I guess it'd be interesting which things they're referring to, but like, yeah, I think it's very interesting how, well, maybe that's one of the things that's wonderful about film is that, and maybe storytelling in general, is we, people are much more willing to accept, in many ways, expect higher virtues from characters in films, even in the cynical age that we live in. Like, people are going to hold characters in films to higher standards than they hold themselves, honestly. Where, and because of that, film becomes a really great place to display virtues and have people applaud them.
Yeah, no, that's true. We kind of, there's a sense in which we still look to certain fictional heroes, kind of connecting it to your thesis, where a lot of people like to look towards classics like the Odyssey, the Iliad. There's in the pagan sense the hero that one focuses on within each story, and we still have a need for that in
Yeah,
the modern age. The MCU is often a noted example of being our Iliad, right? We
yeah,
um, what often comes up is I think we were almost getting to it when we were briefly talking on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but another thing that came up on a recent Pints with Aquinas episode was, and I loved it, was a discussion on where does one actually draw the line in a film.
mm,
Now, while I did kind of do a thesis on it, I think there's always more to be said on it.
Of
Um,
course.
I do want to hear your takes on how one where one ought to draw the line, if at all, in a given film, and how that all works for you.
Yeah, so like on like the content of a film, you mean?
Yeah, sure. Like the content of the film, whether any particular kind of content, uh, however brief, whether it's sexual, violent, or some other offensive thing, whether there's any definitive no one can't watch that film, or if it's short of hardcore porn, then there's wiggle room. So I want to hear your thoughts on the subject, I guess.
Well, in a way, I think that's the one, maybe one of the biggest points for me when it comes to that is the fact that it's very hard to draw kind of a definitive line. And I think people very quickly try to jump to that, where it's sort of like, and I think we tend to have this attitude of, well, if I can't measure it, then it doesn't exist. Like the distinction doesn't exist. Like, so we want something we can measure for what is acceptable content in a film. And I'm not sure that's always going to be the case. I think it's somewhat going to be a question of personal experience. Like, how does this film affect you? But I think even at kind of in a general sense, when we come up with standards for like what we consider acceptable content in a film, those are just kind of conventions we've agreed upon, sort of like, well, who knows where the line is for any individual person, but we're all kind of agreeing on this line because it seems to apply to most people. Where like, yeah, I think like maybe like what you said, like if a film is starting to feel like hardcore porn, like obviously I think we care about being too explicit in that way, that is obviously going too far. um, does that therefore mean that any sexual content, even some visual depictions, are always never acceptable? I'm not sure we can say that because kind of there's the fact that film is a visual medium, and if we're talking about something like sexuality, part of talking about that is going to be showing certain things. So I don't think we want to say that topic is off limits for film. But yeah, then again, there's that issue of I don't know if there's is a definitive line for what's prudent and what is not. Um, but it's funny actually. I think we do see even in secular culture. I think it's a phrase that maybe Christians should adopt more. And I think of the phrase filmmakers talk about responsible filmmaking, where I th- I think that's one good way of putting it, where it's kind of like, is the way this thing is being depicted responsible? Is what it's trying to show to the audience actually going to benefit them, or is it doing something negative? And filmmaker has responsibility to affect his audience positively, so I think he has to be mindful of that.
Yeah. I think one example. So there are different ways one could perceive, say, I think in the Christian communities, sexual content tends to be the most debated aspect of
Of
any
course, yeah.
film. Um, Weirdly more than violence, which is always funny to me. But uh, I think the two sexual moments in a film, with where there's at least an approach to the quote bedroom scene, right? In some of the greatest films of all time, at least in American history, is well, number one, The Godfather
Yeah.
has kind of the approach, right? Um, and there's it kind of while while somewhat morally dubious in how it was done, what it is doing is it's bringing the passion of Michael and her
Hey, what's her name now?
the Greek lady he marries in Sicily, or yeah, in Corleone. So it kind of brings that passion in all at once, and then all of a sudden, spoiler alert, she is obliterated, and you feel his loss, and that's suddenly when a needle turns, and he becomes the big bad gangster of the Godfather series. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and takes on who he thought he was originally going to marry, Kay, as his new wife, but she's not as significant to him as that other girl was. So there's and we don't get any of that sexual connection between him and Kay in the same film.
Hmm.
So there's kind of a defense there for that scene being there, just even if it's just to bring all of our passions in with Michael's. Um, and I haven't seen the other film in a while, but Braveheart has a kind of similar scene, and almost exactly the same purpose, where Gibson's character, he I'm having the worst brain farts of all day today. But Gibson's character marries his wife. They have actually a tastefully done scene of the consummation of marriage, where it's all kind of silhouetted. It's not super visual, um,
Yeah.
but it still reinforces the love and passion he has for his wife when she is brought to her untimely rape and murder. Um, which causes him to lead the rebellion against the British crown. So I think when so those are kind of the examples I tend to bring up, at least when, and then there's always the Bible, right? It has plenty of violence, rape, and murder, and blasphemy of all kinds. So
Mhm.
there's often a very specific reason. There should be a specific reason why certain kinds of content, I think, would be admitted into a film, but there are also all these other films that just don't abide by that.
Well, right. I mean, I think, but in a way, I think one of the most important things is a filmmaker needs to understand, and maybe this is where I think of the idea of responsible filmmaking is filmmaker needs to understand their film can be harmful if they present what they're doing incorrectly, where um even as it's appropriate to talk about, I think, some sexual content in film, you have to understand you can be portraying it in an irresponsible way. You can be an occasion to sin for people, and you can also create a negative understanding of sexuality if you present it incorrectly. Um, so I think that's the important thing, which maybe too many filmmakers in Hollywood aren't don't understand, is that the way one they present sexuality and how explicitly they portray it can be irresponsible. It can affect their audience negatively, and many seem to be operating on the assumption that that's not something they have to worry about it affecting their audience negatively.
Yeah, so I guess there are, in that sense, there are two or three. There are three measures one can take into account, right, to see how morally reprehensible, say, a sexual scene is. I guess the intent of the filmmaker,
Mm-hmm.
um, the mode of production, I suppose, and then the response, the yeah, the reaction by its audience. I think I'm looking for a different kind of word there. But
Mm-hmm.
I guess also the intention of the audience goes a long way there too.
Yeah,
So
sure.
while not all morality hinges strictly on intention, intention does play a big part in deciphering, storytelling methods, I guess.
Well, yeah, and I think I would almost even say when it comes to the filmmaker, also a lack of intention can be one of the concerns. Where I think you see an awful lot of that nowadays, where like sex is just kind of all over the place, and it doesn't seem like they really thought it through why it was there or if they should include it. I think that's almost one of the big concerns is yes, what is the filmmaker trying to convey, but also have they actually thought through what they're trying to convey and whether or not it's going to have a positive effect.
All right, so I guess moving from the topic of I guess specifically sexual morality in film. Uh, One thing I think we also talked about in our last phone conversation, at least maybe I brought up, and I don't know, uh, you might have something to say about it. The idea of sitcoms, especially from like the '90s and the 2000s, they were very comfy, but they were also surprisingly sexual. I don't
Sure.
know if you've seen much of Friends or I don't know, How I Met Your Mother or something like that.
I've watched basically the entire show of Frasier, which is very much, I think, typical. Um, well, yeah, I think in a way it's an interesting thing. I wonder if there was a shift kind of going on at that time, which part of me wonders if we might be moving away from of just being extremely loose with sexual content. I think in many ways kind of advocating for a more loose idea about sex that was in vogue at very much in vogue at that time and still is.
Yeah, it does seem to me like the Me Too movement kind of took that down quite a bit. At least in the secular approach, in the worldwide approach to how to one's sexual life. Um,
Mhm.
One interesting thing I heard. Did you ever watch Always Sunny in Philadelphia?
I have not, no, not partially.
Okay. So it is very offensive. It's still a
Mhm.
sitcom. It's quite funny. And from what I found out, it was meant to be kind of the opposite show of Friends, where and one of the working titles for it was Jerks, kind of meant to be the polar opposite. But there's still a lot of those because it's still early 2000s, a lot of those sexually charged themes going on. But it looks bad because they're terrible people. Um, or they're very obviously terrible people. Um, and it differs from, say, Friends or How I Met Your Mother, which I just had to stop watching both of those because at first, for the first several seasons, it's really comfy. They're very friendly. Obviously, that's a theme of the show. But then they're just kind of stabbing each other in the back as far as friendships go, and then they keep going. The show keeps going, and you're like, these are actually very terrible people. Look at this versus the from the first episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. They're clearly terrible people getting into terrible situations, and that just kind of makes it better somehow. It's kind of weird how that works out. I kind of want, maybe you haven't seen those shows, and sorry if I kind of brought up something that you're not familiar with, but I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, no, I think it's interesting. I mean, even some of maybe those early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, just like Frasier, definitely portray this idea of the main characters kind of stewing in their flaws.
Hmm.
Like, you remember the article by Louise Cowan, who read in school, about the idea of different types of comedy, like paradisal, in purgatorial, and infernal comedy. Like, sort of the idea of purgatorial comedy being sort of a purging, like these are pathetic people, but their suffering improves them, which I think is very much what older sitcoms were about. Um, some more modern sitcoms definitely lean towards this idea of infernal comedy, where it's miserable people making each other miserable,
Hmm.
where their flaws are just on display as flaws because comedy is kind of about suffering, but this is all about suffering that they bring upon themselves, kind of by being terrible people.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I need to get back once I get my reading packets back from California. Um, I'm gonna have to look at that because I want to read that essay again. Because
Yeah,
obviously taking on the theme of Dante with the infernal, purgatorial, and the paradisal comedies, uh,
yeah,
taking these classical themes, I think, is something that could really help the culture improve its mode of approaching film and modern entertainment.
well, no, absolutely, and I think there's a lot of merit to to that idea of infernal comedy. Like it's very old in film. Like I think of the Three Stooges, for example. Like those are not moral characters. That's not the point of their characters. It very much is. These are jerks making each other miserable, mainly through slapstick. Um, but the what we think of as being kind of the more wholesome type of comedy really is like more purgatorial comedy. Think of the Dick Van Dyke Show, for example, from the '60s, where it's very much kind of like these are basically good people that this is about, but their flaws do keep getting in the way, and that's where the humor comes from. But they do learn a lesson usually by the end of the episode.
Hmm.
Um, or modern sitcoms, and again, I would point to something like Frasier as an example. And from what little I've seen of, say, something like Community, for example, or what I've heard about Always Sunny in Philadelphia, is very much that. Like the flaws are much more center stage. The odds of them learning a lesson by the end of the episode are much less likely. Where, yeah, it's like they have this flaw, it makes them miserable. The end.
Right. Now the concept of paradisal comedy is still a little fuzzy to me,
Yeah.
and that may also be stem or at least connected to when I read Dante's Paradiso. It was really hard to read, much harder than the previous two.
Yeah.
Um, Probably because it's so uh, uh, not cerebral, but ethereal. It's very spiritually moved. But do you think there's any kind of comedy that exists that would fall under paradisal from what you can figure out from that?
Yeah, I think it's tricky because I mean, part of what Cowan says is paradisal comedy is in a way very close to something like lyrical poetry, where it's simply the good on display, where the whole point of it is there is no conflict, like there is no suffering to be overcome, which is why it's paradise. And it is very difficult to think of examples like it. In a weird way, one example that has come to mind, not that this film doesn't have conflict, was The Martian, if you're familiar with that,
Yeah.
where obviously that film is about conflict. Obviously, it's a man trying to survive in this outlandish situation, but the film the film is just incredibly positive. It's very much about almost like nobody misses a beat on doing the right thing for the most part. Where yes, he has all these problems to overcome, but he stays super optimistic and he keeps overcoming those problems, and kind of the rest of the world supports him with continuing to overcome those problems. Like the point of the film is very much to show kind of the best version of humanity, and in a way it doesn't need that conflict to be funny. The film is hilarious kind of with its positivity.
Oh, that's very true. No, I like that. Well, and that's really cool that you actually were able to bring up a movie that had that sense of um, the just the good of everyone being shown up front. And
Yeah.
while there's conflict, often the whole point of a story is there's conflict, there's drama. So it makes it even harder to really point to a particular, well, any form of modern entertainment without that sense of drama or conflict, because we on Earth are as good as we get, probably are more purgatorial than paradisal. Um, so that's interesting. I'm gonna have
Yeah.
to watch The Martian because it's been a couple of years, but yeah, I'm gonna have to look at that in that new light. That's awesome. Um,
Yeah.
and I guess so. For lack of any other better questions, I'm coming down to the end of my list here, but one really fun question that I might just start asking on more of my shows um, are what classic movie one there's a two-part question. What classic movie do you think shouldn't really be considered a classic? And then secondarily, what movie that is not really considered a classic do you think should be considered a classic?
Oh, that is an interesting question. Hmm. Well, at least something it made me think of now that you say that. Like, I think one thing that has definitely happened with me with watching some older films is there's a couple films I've seen where I it took me a while to kind of figure out what made it a classic. Like, frankly, even interestingly, The Godfather was a bit of an experience like that for me, where I know it's considered one of the greatest movies of all time, and I definitely thought it was a great film when I saw it. It took me a while to kind of wrap my head around what the hype was about, was the interesting thing. Like, maybe it's just because it's so emphasized. It didn't seem quite as remarkable as people made it sound, but I think as you're aware, there's all these intricacies you start to unpack over time. And
Yeah,
for that,
it does take like two or three watches to kind of get everything, put everything together and know exactly what's going on because it's very political and all of that.
quite so, yeah. Um, well, maybe in terms of films that should be classics that aren't. Let me see if I can just throw out something I feel like people don't talk about enough. Like, well, one film actually that I've watched, which has really impressed me, which I think it's a known film, but maybe not much by that many people, is a film called The Big Country. I don't know if you're familiar. It's by William Wyler. He's the same director who did say Ben-Hur. Um, but it stars Gregory Peck, and it's a very interesting film in that it's. I mean, plenty of films have done this, but it kind of deconstructs the Western storyline, where it's basically a Western where the you might say the greenhorn is the hero of the story, where kind of the stuck-up Easterner comes into this world. Everyone's looking down upon him, but you just kind of start to realize, oh, he actually is exemplifying all these virtues that maybe they're missing throughout the course of the story.
Oh, interesting.
Where, yeah, I think that's a very interesting film where one, it is just a great Western in and of itself, but it does deconstruct it by showing someone doing the opposite of what we expect the Western hero to do. Specifically, for example, continuing to avoid getting into fights. Like he's very deliberately kind of making that decision to not fight when people would have expected him to fight because he doesn't think it's going to solve the problem.
It's kind of the almost the antithesis of the man who shot Liberty Valance.
Right. Yeah. No, it definitely does resemble that. I think it pushes in that theme even further, almost where it really kind of surprises you. It'd be as if Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, if James Stewart really did turn out to be the hero, where everyone thinks he's going to be a fool, but ultimately they're surprised. No, he actually knows better how to behave honorably and responsibly than many of us are, and we've kind of underestimated him.
That's really cool. Yeah, I'm gonna have to check out that movie, as should all the audience, as I found out that it doesn't have a particular rating, but it was approved. So yeah,
No, and yeah, I don't think it's a Western. It obviously has some violence and some intense subject matter, but I
it's
don't think it's
1958, so it's not super intense. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Oh, cool. I don't have any other questions for you. I don't know if you have any other topics you'd like to talk about. Um,
Not burning, I suppose, but
what's that?
not burning topics, I suppose, but
Sure, yeah. Well, that's all I have today. Yeah, JP, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you very much. Thank you, audience, for watching, and y'all have a good day. God bless.